Good morning. Yes, I'm on. Good morning. Well, maybe I'll come on in. I want to get started because I know I'm going to run out of time. I've been going over this over and over and cutting things, and I still run out of time. And now this is falling apart on me, so it's a good start. All right. Well, for those who are expecting Danny this morning, we did a little bait and switch, so you have to suffer through me instead. Just some things. We're going to talk today about the last word in 2 Peter 1:7, and that's love. Now, truthfully, the last two words are love, but we'll talk about that. But that's our subject for today. So this is our verse that we've been looking at. That looks smaller than it did at home. Sorry about that. And get down there to verse 7. Godliness. The two things we haven't talked about yet are brotherly affection and brotherly affection with love. Said we're skipping ahead because Danny and I needed to switch weeks. So let's talk about love. What is love? Well, when you get into the New Testament, you're talking about Greek language, not English language. And in ancient Greek, there are actually 6 words that normally translate into English as love. Now, we're fortunate that the New Testament only uses 4 of them, but I'm going to talk about them real quick, all right? And it's good we're not talking about Hebrew because there are at least 9, and some scholars would argue as many as 12 words in Hebrew that would equate as love. So the first one is eros, and if Brian's in here, he can laugh at my bad Greek pronunciation later, because me and Greek are, well, it's like Greek to me. Eros is like physical or sexual desire. That's that kind of love. We have philia, which is brotherly love or strong friendship, like blood brothers. We have philotia, which is love of oneself. And then we have agape, which is one like we're a little more familiar with. And agape is sacrificial or unconditional love, and that is the word that's used here in 2 Peter. I'm just going to briefly mention the other two that aren't mentioned in the New Testament. One is pragma, from which we get pragmatic. And this is sort of like a dutiful or obligatory kind of love, like a love one might have for like an extended family member, and you would do something for them out of a sense of duty. You have that sort of love towards them, okay? And then there's mania, which I think you can figure out pretty quick, mania. This is, obsessive, this is idol worship, this is stalking someone. In ancient Greek texts, anytime you see mania used, it's never with a good connotation. We don't see that in the New Testament, but I want to bring it up later. So when we get down back to 1 Peter 1, when we get down to verse 7, we actually have 2 of the words there. So he says, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, self-control with steadfastness, steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with Philadelphia. Not the city, which is the most ironically named city in the entire history of the world. And with Philadelphia, agape, love, okay? Now, I notice here it's the last one in the list. And I think maybe it's one for us as human beings to reach that point. We need all these other things to really understand and be able to operate with agape sort of love. Conversely, in Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit are mentioned, and the very first word is agape. The fruit of the Spirit is agape, love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, godliness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's the first of the fruit of the spirits. Here it's the last thing that Peter mentions. And again, I think, this is my opinion obviously, that he puts it last because you got to kind of go through all these other steps to get to a place where you can actually be like that. So, now, who are we called to love? Well, in Matthew 5, I'm going to mess this up, by the way, because even though I've gone through it, I tend to go off. In Matthew 5, Jesus said, You've heard it, that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and yes, the word there is agape, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do that? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than anyone else? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? This is, of course, based on Leviticus 19:17, where it's written that you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Well, how well do I follow these commandments? What kind of love do I have for my neighbor? Who do I show love to? And what kind of love do I show? Do I have this pragmatic, logical, obligatory love for my close circle of friends? Do I have, do I have mania? Do I have a mania for the people that agree with me? Do I have a mania for a particular cause or political party, et cetera, et cetera? Again, in the ancient Greek, that word never has a good connotation, okay? It's always obsessive, and it's always from a selfish standpoint. Do I love people from a selfish standpoint? It's something I need to ask myself. Am I showing love to someone out of what I'm going to get in return? That's not really agape. That's not the love that Jesus has called us to. He calls us to have that kind of love for all. In Matthew 5:39, yeah, David.
Can you speak to love as an emotion, love as an action, love as a noun kind of? Because when we think about love, we think about maybe an action. I love somebody, I do things that I love them. But that's not the same. There's no emotion necessarily in the love for your enemies kind of thing.
Truth. Okay, so that's a good question. I would say we need to approach love the same way as again, I'm going to go to Greek, even though I don't know that much about Greek. I'm going to approach love the same way I do faith. In English, faith is always a noun. In Greek, it's a noun, it's also a verb, okay? So there's an action that is called for in faith. We don't necessarily get that when we read it in English because, again, it's only a noun. But in the ancient Greek, faith is also a verb. It's an action that we do. And I think love is the same. I need to have an emotional response. I need to think love, but I also need to act out that love. Because if I don't act out that love, I think it's sort of like, what we're told about faith. Faith without works is dead. Well, love without works is dead too. I can say I love you all I want. If I don't show it, then that's just so many words. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking when you love your enemy, there's not the same kind of emotion that you have for some of the other loves that you're talking about, like friends and family and that sort of thing. So different.
That's fair. You're getting way ahead of me. Good for you. Okay. But yeah, it's hard to love your enemy. It's very difficult to love someone who hates you and does terrible things to you and persecutes you, right? I had to replace the alternator on one of my cars last week, about 10 days ago. And every time I work on a car, that thing about pray for those who persecute you is really tested in me because I swear automakers every year try and figure out how to make it more and more difficult for me to work on a car. But I pray for them anyway because they're definitely persecuting me. So I want to look over at Matthew 5:39 just for a minute here, where Jesus says, "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also." Most of us don't realize this. Jesus is talking about a very specific problem in first century Palestine because you've got a clash of two societies happening. You've got Roman society and Jewish society. And, the Romans have come in and taken over. but B, there are societal norms of Jews and there are societal norms of Romans, and they don't mesh. And this is one of those instances, because we know from a couple of old books on Roman history that one of the practices of the Roman army is when the garrison was marching down a road, there would be two men out front, and they would call out to people who were in the road, hey, move or you're going to get trampled. And if they got to the point where the person was still there, they would turn them around and smack them on the right cheek and knock them off the road, okay? Now that sounds very rude and blunt, and it is, but it's better than being trampled to death by the garrison who were not allowed to stop. Only the centurion could tell them to stop, and the centurion wasn't supposed to tell them to stop until they got where they were going, okay? So this was common practice. Romans understood this. Regular Roman citizens understood, okay, you know, if a soldier comes up and smacks me, it's because I wasn't paying attention. Oh, thank you for not letting me be killed by being trampled to death. Well, in Jewish society, among the many sayings of the rabbinical oral law, it said you never slap someone with the back of your hand. Because if you're angry at someone and you slap them this way because it acknowledges them as a human being. If you slap them with this way, you're dismissing them and you're taking away all of their dignity, and it's a double insult. Well, Roman soldiers have no idea what Jewish society is. They're just going about their normal routines. However, the Jew who's being smacked on the right cheek says, you have just dismissed me as a person, you know, I should have every right to like pull out a knife and stab you, okay? So Jesus is addressing a very specific thing here. If they smack you on the right cheek, just turn and say, at least hit me on the left cheek and acknowledge me as a human being, okay? So, and that is saying, I am acknowledging you as a human being. I want you to acknowledge me as a human being. There's a sort of a beginning of a relationship there rather than being smacked out of the way, and now I hate you and I'd like to kill you, okay? So I'm called to be okay with the soldier knocking me out of the way, even though in my society it's not okay in any way. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about clashing cultures and how we run into each other. Jesus calls us to have agape for everyone. That's not human nature. It's not, okay? We are very tribalistic, and it comes from, you know, history, you know, and when we were all living out in our own little feudalisms, and boy, I hope something bad happens to them so we can go take their food, right? It's very survivalist and self-obsessed, and it hadn't gone away. So I want to just talk about three little instances. Number one is this experiment that some people did with fifth graders in Robbers Cave, Oklahoma. Anybody know Robbers Cave besides me? I've actually been there. It's a little park nowadays, but it's called Robbers Cave because back in the 1800s, outlaws used to hide there, okay? Well, they took these group of fifth graders from all across the state. None of them knew each other. It was almost kind of like an Allstate thing. If you don't know what Allstate is, sorry. I don't mean the insurance. And they brought all these kids together, and then they separated them into two groups. This one was the Eagles, and this one was the Rattlers. And they started to have competitions with each other. And the very first day that they began doing these little competitive games, the very first day, the fifth graders started to call the other group's names. I know, shocking, fifth graders, right? The second day, there were verbal threats of physical abuse going on. And the third day, 3 fights broke out. And the fourth day, they decided to jump ahead and go to the thing that they were going to do on the 6th and 7th day, was where the two groups had to work together for a thing that was threatening both of them. And they decided, we need to move ahead of that because one of these kids is going to end up in the hospital if we keep going the way we're going, okay? So all these kids who didn't know each other suddenly had a bond in their mind with their group against the other one. Okay? Now, let me tell you this one, because this one's even a little scarier, frankly. Okay? So this fellow, Henri Taifel, I don't know if he's French or what, I didn't really get that. He did this experiment online. I want to see just where is the point that people get to where they get this competitive nature and I got to beat those other people. So he had this experiment listed out of like 10 different things. And he got people online. None of them had ever met each other. And then he showed them a page with a bunch of dots on it and said, how many dots are on the page? People who guessed less than the actual number were put in one group. People who guessed more than were put in the other group. He didn't tell them if they'd guessed less or more. He just put them in two groups, and then they got the first names of all the people that were in their group. That's it. They never got to talk to each other. They never saw a face, nothing. Just a list of names that, for all they knew, could have been made up. The first experiment was, okay, so you have to make a choice, each of you. The choice is you can get $100 for everyone on your team, and the other group also gets $100. Or you can choose that everyone on your team gets $75 and everyone on the other team only gets $25. Now, what's the smart choice? Take the $100, right? 71% of the people doing this voted to take $75 so they could spite the other team. 71%. They'd never even met each other. They had no affinity except that I'm in Group A. And those Group B people. He stopped. He didn't need to go any further. The very first nonsensical thing that he didn't think, well, everyone's going to pick $100 each. What? Okay.
That should only be for Cowboys fans.
For Group B's Cowboys fans. So much hate, right? So much hate. We do it in sports. Unfortunately, we do it in real life too. So another a medical experiment I read about was they did a functional MRI scan. And if you don't know what schadenfreude is, it's taking joy in the pain of other people. And so each person was told certain things. They figured out, what these people's political, social, etc. affinities were. And then they shared with them good news about their group, bad news about their group, good news about people that are at odds with them, and bad news about people that are at odds with them. And in nearly every case, the most pleasant reaction recorded from the brain scans was from hearing bad news about the other group. That's sad, that's frightening. And I look in the mirror and go, you know what? I've been that person. I have been that person who said, yeah, Atlanta Falcons 28-3. Because Saints and Falcons fans don't get along, okay? But it's frightening. And it's apparently our nature, our human nature. We're called to get rid of that, right? Jesus said, deny yourself. I think that's a big part of the self that I'd like to see gotten rid of. Part of it comes from the need in ourselves to have an identity. It's the basic existential question. Who am I? Why am I here? I need an identity. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think God has put that in our hearts because he wants us to seek him, because he is our identity. We find ourselves by losing ourselves and taking on Jesus. But for a lot of people, that doesn't happen. And it certainly didn't happen for me growing up. As a middle schooler, I was experimenting with all sorts of identities. I didn't really know who I was, and I got into, briefly, because I actually can't stand heavy metal, but briefly I was like, metalhead, and I started drinking because, hey, it's cool. Well, fortunately, God is benevolent, and he let me smash my head against a wall a couple of times, and I realized this is stupid. I'm a fool if I keep doing this. And I tried a few other things, and I found myself coming back to Jesus. Thank you, okay? But we do that. We're looking for an identity. And it's easy to find an identity in a particular group. Now I identify this is my group, okay? And once I get in that this is my group thing, that can become my idol really fast, really fast. And then I'm going to do everything I can to safeguard my group, and let's knock down the other groups. We see it all the time. And I lost my place. I'm good with that. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Let's say about how does Jesus react to these tribalistic notions? Well, first, Matthew 8:5-13, which is also in Luke, the centurion comes to him, right, and says, my servant, my favored servant is ill, he can't move, it looks like he's going to die, I'd like you to heal him. And Jesus says, let's go. And the centurion says, no, you don't need to come into my house. Apparently he knows some about Jewish laws. He says, just say the word. You know, I'm a centurion. When I say the word, someone does it. You know, I know that if you say the word, it'll be done. And Jesus talks about his faith. But what I look at is the interaction between these two, because this is not normal, okay? A Roman came up to a Jew, and the Jew responded positively. He didn't go, oh, how can I get out of this? Jesus says, yeah, what is it? What can I do for you? And the Roman treated him with respect too, which not usual. The Romans disliked the Jews as much as the Jews disliked the Romans. Jesus just says, with that, I've got no time for that societal nonsense. You're a human being, and I'm going to relate to you. Okay. John 4, the woman at the well. Jesus breaks all sorts of societal laws here, okay? Number one, Jews and Samaritans despised each other. I won't get into that because we give at least half an hour on that easily. Just know they despised each other. You're not supposed to, as a Jew, you're not supposed to talk to Samaritans. As a Samaritan, you're not supposed to talk to Jews because those are those people, right? More so, in rabbinical law of that time, a man is not supposed to speak to a woman except for his wife or his mother or his sister. That is it, okay? It is basically a sin to go and talk to any other. If you need to give a message to a woman, then I as a man go to her husband and tell him, and he tells her. That's how this works. Now, I think that law is put in because of the idea of, well, let's just prevent any way of lust happening or improper relations. So I think there was some good intentions behind it, but in reality, what it did was it made women's status even lower and robbed them of even more dignity. Jesus has no time for this stuff, right? He comes to this woman and he speaks to her. She's a woman, B, she's a Samaritan. He's not supposed to talk to her. And he goes right up to her and says, could you get me some water? Third, she's living in sin. She is living in sin, okay? He says, hey, you're right to say you're not married, you have 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now isn't your husband. He already knows, right? Well, again, rabbinical law, Jesus is unclean for talking to her. He has no time for that. He has no time for that. This is a person who's hurting. This is a person who needs salvation. This is a person who needs to hear the message that he has to give, and he talks to her. And she turns her life around. The disciples, okay? We don't know that much about what the disciples did. The Gospels really only tell us that at least 4 of them were fishermen. Some of the early church fathers mention what some of the other ones did before they were disciples. We don't know if they're right or not. But the main point is that none of them were disciple material. None of them. They were fishermen. They were farmers. There was a builder. A tax collector? Seriously? None of them were disciple materials. Now you might come back and say, oh, wait a minute, Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. Yes, he was. John the Baptist was not recognized as having authority to have disciples by the authoritative rabbis. So as far as they were concerned, Andrew being a disciple, that's a joke, because that guy has no business having disciples. Jesus picks these guys because he can see what they will be and he can see what their potential is. He doesn't go with societal norms, because societal norms say you go and you watch you watch these students grow and you see how they go. This one might have potential because of all the things that he's learned. Jesus doesn't do that. This one's hard for me, but following Jesus is what's important. All these other things tear us apart, and they don't matter because they're not eternal. I have a set of first cousins. There's 4. There's 3 sisters and a brother. 2 of them are staunch conservatives. 2 of them are staunch liberals. And for the last, I would guess, about 20 years, they do not even speak to each other. They're siblings. They grew up in the same house. They were taught the same things by their parents. They all are Church of Christ members, and they're all regular attendees of their different congregations. They will not talk to each other. They have skipped weddings. They have skipped family outings because they do not want to see this group, does not want to see this group, and vice versa. Well, about a year ago, my cousin, the brother, passed away from cancer. He's approximately 10 to 12 years older than me. I can't remember for certain. To the best of my knowledge, they never reconciled their relationships because of politics. Really? Politics. Won't talk to each other, won't see each other. He died of cancer, and as far as I know, these 2 never didn't even go see him. And as far as I know, this sister still hasn't tried to reconcile with him, even though her brother died. I mean, can you have a more thing right in your face that maybe you made things right with your siblings? It's awful. It tears me apart because while I didn't grow up in the same town with them, we visited pretty often, and I know all of them well. And it just tears me up that they don't talk to each other. It's horrible, okay? Easy to do. Easy trap to fall into. And it's worse now than ever, right? No. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun." Don't let anybody tell you about how much worse things are today and how much better things were in the past. They're not, okay? I'm going to go way back in the past and talk about two rabbis who are still famous to this day, Shammai and Hillel. They're still the 2 main rabbinical schools to this day, some 2,000 odd years later. Hillel was what you might call the liberal, and Shammai was what you might call the conservative. That's a really bad terms to use for them. They're both serious legalists. They disagreed basically on 3 issues and had sharp disagreements over them. But they were the best of friends, and they talked constantly. Hillel was the head of the Sanhedrin. He died right around the time Jesus was born. Shammai became the head of the Sanhedrin after Hillel because Hillel recommended him as to be the one to follow him. Okay? They had the greatest respect for each other. Unfortunately, the following generations did not. The disciples of Shammai and Hillel continued these, oh no, I'm getting ahead of myself. No, back. Continued their disputes. And not sure, about a couple years before the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they decided they were going to have a big powwow between all of the disciples and talk about how to treat the Romans. It turns out this was never supposed to be a powwow. This was a slaughter. The disciples of Shammai decided that the disciples of Hillel were too far gone and they needed to get rid of them. So they invited them all to this man's house to have a big debate, and as they came in, they killed each one that entered. because they didn't agree over the Romans. If you know about this, in 1856 is the Brooks-Sumner affair. Make sure I say who's who. Preston Brooks was a representative of Kansas, U.S. representative of Kansas. Sumner was a U.S. senator from Massachusetts. Sumner called out the Kansas senator over the issue of slavery, which they were debating, you can guess, 1856, you know what's coming. And he used some language that really shouldn't ever be repeated. Brooks was this fellow's brother-in-law. So at the end of the Senate session, Brooks heard about this, came over from the U.S. House of Representatives with a cane, walked into the Senate floor and began beating Sumner with the cane. He beat him till he was bloody and unconscious. And he tapped the cane on the floor and said, "This is the way that an unruly dog should be treated," and he left. And no one stepped in to intervene. They all just watched it happen. These things come from an anxiety cycle that I've read about. The anxiety of the crusader, the anxiety of the hunted, and the anxiety of the bystander. And again, it's all about them. The anxiety of the crusader says, I have to overtake those people because they're going to destroy my way of life. The anxiety of the hunted says, I have to get away from those people because they're coming to destroy me and my way of life. And in case those don't sound like mirror images, they are. And the anxiety of the hunted quickly turns into the anxiety of the crusader. And then there's the anxiety of the bystander. And the anxiety of the bystander says, I better not speak up or I'll get attacked too. Two quick examples, one a Republican, one a Democrat. So David French, I think Brian has mentioned him recently. David French is an attorney and a conservative author. Well, in 2016, he didn't like some of the things Donald Trump was saying. And he very verbally went out and said, we need not to support this man. He's not a good candidate for us. Well, the extreme conservative wing of the Republican Party attacked him, verbally attacked him. He received death threats. His family received death threats because he was a traitor. And he was kowtowing to the Clintons by saying these things. On the other side, Democrat Joe Lieberman was once the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. A few years after that, as a senator, he supported an issue that the Republicans supported. And he said, yeah, I am in agreement with them. Well, this was a big issue of contention between Democrats and Republicans. And all the other Democrats labeled him a traitor. They started calling him out, and he was driven out of the Democratic Party. He finished his senator as being an independent rather than Democrat. He'd been the vice presidential candidate, for heaven's sake, right? And these types of things bring on the anxiety of the bystander. I'm watching my group do something that I don't agree with, but if I speak out, they might attack me too, so I don't say anything. And Senator Sumner lies on the floor bleeding and unconscious and doesn't return to health for 2 to 3 months because I'm standing there not wanting to get beaten too. It's scary how we are, but we're called to be different. Colossians 3 says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, hearing with one another, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against each other, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, you must also forgive. And above all these things, put on love, agape, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. High anxiety. Has this ever been you? I don't know anyone who's guilty of this, not in this room, who has decided, boy, I really need to craft a very smart reply to that because this person is so wrong, right? And I need to let them know how wrong they are. I need to grow up. That's what it is, okay? It seems like things are worse than they were in the past. They're not, but it seems like it because social media is a great magnifying glass. events and things that might have just blown over and we've never even heard about. Instead, they're blasted all across the world, right, on social media. The entire world gets to know about some nonsensical incident or some nonsensical opinion that some guy who used to be a celebrity 45 years ago says. Oh, can you imagine what this guy said? Who cares, right? Okay, but we care. We got to say, oh no, this is not good, all right? And again, it just tears us apart. And that wound is sitting there for anyone to see. And then people start commenting on it. And so the wound stays open, and it begins to fester, and it gets worse. And soon there are sides drawn over this thing that we would have never even known about if not for social media. Okay? So it seems worse. It's really not. It's the same thing it's always been, but it seems worse. We're called to be different. Ecclesiastes 7:9 says, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." And again, I can speak from experience, because when I have anger in my heart, boy, do I act like a fool. Done it. Thank you for opening my eyes. Oh, I skipped it, that's why. James 1, and I know Brian's been saying this, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God, okay? This is not producing the righteousness of God. Me making sure that everyone knows that I'm right isn't producing the righteousness of God. We need to change our mindset, okay? When we enter into a discussion, when we enter into an argument, a diatribe, whatever you want to call it, a social situation, we need to change our objective. Let's not go in with righteous indignation. It's easy to do when it's something that is over a Christian belief. It's easy to go in with righteous indignation and say, I am right. It's not what Jesus calls us to. Let's change our attitude of let me go in and win this argument. Forget that. Let me go in and understand where my brother is coming from. Why do they believe what they believe? What is their background? What is their experience that makes them okay with this thing that I'm not okay with? And let me go in to that argument, not trying to win an argument, but trying to gain a friend. And trying to share the message of Jesus. Not bludgeoning over the head to tell them how wrong they are. I don't need to condemn the world. I'm not called to condemn the world. The world condemns itself. I'm called to share the message that God says, I've got salvation. Just come on over. That's what I need to be sharing. Not, oh, you're so wrong. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time. I knew I'd never get through this. We can't let these things tear us apart from other human beings. Especially, we can't let it tear us apart from our brothers in Christ. All of those things are secondary. Only God, through his offering of his Son, is able to fix the world. And that's on a one-at-a-time basis. We change each heart. We can't rely on the UN or the World Health Organization or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or QAnon or Black Lives Matter or Greenpeace or the military or the National Rifle Association or the Constitution of the United States or whatever government you pick throughout the world. None of those things are going to fix the world. None of those things are going to fix brokenness of ourselves. There's only one thing that's going to do that, and that's Jesus and the Spirit of God coming into our hearts. Amen. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to support any of the things I just listed. All of those things have good intention, every single one of them. And every single one of them have done good things, and every single one of them have done bad things, because they're human institutions, and they're run by people, and people are messed up. All I got to do is look in the mirror and know that. Right? Okay. Our trust is in the Lord. Our trust is in the Lord. And we are called, I'm going to skip ahead. No, I'm going to go back. I lied. Okay. There's a tendency, a trend now about this thing, toxicity. And if someone comes to me and says something I don't like, they're toxic. And I need to remove them from my life. It's a very scary thing, and it's being preached a lot to our young people. And not just our young people, it's being preached to us too. You know, if your parents say something that's against what you're doing, well, they're just toxic, and you need to just cut them out of your life. And don't think I'm making that up, because I've lived through it. Hello? How about Jeroboam? Do you remember Jeroboam? Jeroboam became king and said, what should I do? Should I keep things as is? Should I raise taxes? And a lot of people gave him good advice who were older, and then his friends gave him advice that he wanted to hear. And what advice did he follow? He followed the advice he wanted to hear, and he cut out those other people, because they're toxic. They're telling me stuff I don't want to hear. And what happened? The kingdom of God's people split into two, never to be rejoined. Never. It remained split until one of the kingdoms disappeared entirely, because he wouldn't listen to the advice that he needed to hear. Well, you and me are just the same as Jeroboam. We need to hear the things we don't want to hear. We need to listen to opinions that we don't agree with. Even if the person's wrong, we need to listen. How am I ever going to reach someone for Christ if I shut them out? If I turn them off because they don't agree with me? Well, I got news for you. My father used to say this: if we all insist on agreeing on every little point of every little thing, we're all going to end up in a church of one real fast. And we're probably going to be disillusioned with the church of one pretty quickly too, because let's be honest, I disagree with myself a lot. Okay? So, we are not called to bludgeon people into believing. We are called to speak truth in love. Now I'm going to skip way ahead. Oh, and I went right past it. We're called in Ephesians 4:15 to speak truth in love. Love isn't letting people do whatever they want. Okay? If someone's dancing on a railroad line and I hear a train coming, is it loving to sit there and go, "You dance, man. Good for you. Glad you're enjoying that." Pretty sure that's kind of hateful, honestly, right? I'll let the train hit him. I don't like him anyway. That's not love. Love is saying, hey, get off the track. There's a train coming. And if they won't get off the track and the train's coming, what's loving is to run over there and knock them off the track. They might be mad at me for knocking them off the track, but they didn't die. Speak truth. It's loving to speak truth. But I speak truth in love. Not speak truth with, I'm going to bash you on the head until you see things right. That's not love either. And I'm totally out of time. Any final questions or comments? Good. Let's pray. Blessed are you, Lord, for giving us your commandments, for giving us your word. Thank you for the Spirit that you've put on our hearts. Lord, help us to remember that Spirit is there in every moment of our lives.